I want to do. If I want to read through First Ezra, uh, 2 to 18, which correspond to Ezra 4 and 12. So Ezra chapter 4 verse 12 uh, has an exact parallel in First Ezra chapter 2 verse 18. So if you go to if you go to Ezra, um, it's talking about Zerubbabel, which you can see in Zechariah 3. Um, Zerubbabel, no, Zechariah 4. Zerubbabel, in Zechariah 6, this shoot. Um, this was some sort of kind of millennialism that happened back then, and this says, then Zerubbabel and Jesus, and this Jesus is Yehoshua, who is this is kind of like a split type of Messiah, how Jesus was both high priest and seed of David. Here you have Zerubbabel, seed of David, and Jesus, the high priest. This is in Ezra chapter 4, verse 3. And then so it talks about this decree from Cyrus, and if you look through secular history, Cyrus is the Messiah in terms of anointed, but he's not like the Davidic Messiah because uh, he was Gentile. You can see in Daniel 5 he was called Cyrus the Mede, and so here it says in the reign of Ahasuerus, which is a way that they throw it off with like also as Esther, and in Nehemiah, whenever they have this artificial king, it's Ahasuerus or Azurzes, who scholars would say is Artaxerxes, because if you look at Esther, the way to describe it is the way First Ezra talks about Darius, but Darius means king, and there's a Darius before Artaxerxes and one after, and this and they would say it would be Xerxes. Ahasuerus would be Xerxes, but the problem with that is Artaxerxes comes later, and so you have this big time span, which would be from like 400 BC all the way to 530, and it would be impossible for one to live that long. And so this name Ahasuerus, which you see in Esther and Nehemiah, when you add in First Esdras, you have all these different kings. You have like maybe 4 different kings. So you have this decree to go out and restore Jerusalem coming like 4 separate times, and all these little blips along the way. And the problem with that is, like you see here in Ezra 5, they talk about Haggai and Zechariah. And you know that the latest prophets are Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And Malachi is actually Ezra. So they talk about the intertestamental period before 100 years. Then it's a problem when you have back at the beginning of captivity. So it should be 700 years later after it follows, because it says Jeremiah had 70 years. So, it's time Daniel talking about Daniel 9. It's going to begin in 516. Well, if you go to 516 down to 400, it's a long time for like Haggai and Zechariah and all these people to be living. So this is very popular idea in Judaism of this great council. And, and you can see if when you go back to Old Testament, people live in long periods of time. Like Joshua, he said, I'm 85 years old, and I'm going to lead you through battle at 85 years old. And so it's not really realistic, especially when you think about people not having the access to healthcare and things, and advanced medicine, and the kind of the brutishness of it all. So we see that if you wrote up to verse 12, Ezra chapter 4, verse 12, it say, "Be it known to the king." So okay, unless I get to that far, but you see Mithridates is a name, which in Aramaic, so they've taken Aramaic form, Ezra. So this is, Mithridates is a famous name in Pontus, and so the Romans, to establish a stake in Pilate, which would be like, I mean not Pilate, Pontius Pilate, but in Pontus, to have a Pilate, they would need to defeat Mithridates, who was seated from the Syrian Greeks, and also had made lots of good connections with the people of the Black Sea, and was actually a respected king, and he was feared by the Romans. And that's not the same guy, but as I'm saying about the late dating of the authorship of the Bible, that they come into this problem that when they say, "Oh, it happened in the 6th century," well, when you go all the way down to the 4th century, when the Greeks took over, they can't get over that obstacle. They can't say, "Well, the Greeks wrote it," or sorry, it was written in Greek era, because they have to say it was written in this older time period. And this is a problem they have with Q and a lot of sources for the New Testament, is they say, "Well, Matthew couldn't have copied Luke because Luke followed Paul, and Matthew was with Jesus, so it's impossible. So therefore Luke couldn't." So they make up this whole queue, when really what happened was Matthew was copying Luke, but because he disagreed with certain parts about Luke, he didn't copy him verbatim, and with added more Jewish knowledge of the Old Testament, there's a lot of fulfilling of prophecy and stuff that Luke added, and doesn't mean that just because they say it was Matthew, and the book of Matthew never says it was Matthew, the apostles, they would say, well, therefore Matthew couldn't have copied Luke, even though all the evidence points to Luke definitely didn't copy Matthew. That's for sure. And Luke copied Mark, and Matthew seems to have copied Mark and Luke, and so you run into this problem. A lot of people that have to say it was written in the time that they want to believe it was written in, that they can't get over this obstacle. So they will say, "Oh, the scholars all agree with me," and that's because the scholars are all Christian. And I'm not saying they're not Christian, but I'm just not going to believe it just because they say it, because it doesn't say it right here when I'm looking at the boldface print. It's not that what they say it is, because here we have in Ezra chapter 5, they have Haggai, Zechariah, all these different people. And so, and Zerubbabel and all them, and Yehoshua, and they all came, uh, you know, in this time of Ezra. And you go down to Nehemiah, when they try to make this gap of 100 years, that they want to seamlessly cross over 100 years. We see him talking about Ezra, the things talking about in First Ezra, same list of people, same names and everything. I mean, people have studied these names, and they can say, well, you go to Nehemiah and you go to Ezra, and there's the same name, and that's a problem. This is the guy who's son of this guy, and then I mean the events corroborate, and then there's really weird duplicity where Ezra and Nehemiah seem to be talking about the same events but happening hundreds of years apart. And so that runs into the problem with, as I say in verse 12. So verse 12 is be it known to the king that the Jews came. So they want to say this was like the Samaritans, and this is how Ezra want to spin it. That he wants to spin it like the Edomites aren't Israelites, and that's how they went back and wrote, all these other books and stuff, to try to distance the Edomites and try to make them like they're not Jacob's brother, even though they clearly are, and try to make them Arabs and say that they inhabited their land. Well, guess what? If they inhabited the land of the Edomites, then the Edomites are just going to live in the next town, and eventually they're going to be in the same country. And so we do see that they become the same country. And so Herod had, like David, maybe David's meaning something into this Herod, like it wasn't Herod, it was Antipater, his father. And so, just like David's son Solomon was, the one who inherited everything, Antipater had made all these connections with like the Nabateans and the Idumeans, and built an alliance. And then there was all these competing factions in Jerusalem, and the Romans had decided on the Herods, and they seemed to be legitimate power because there's peace in the city until 70 AD. So, for many generations of the Herods, there was a sense of peace in Jerusalem. And so, say, so these Samaritans were trying to write back. So I guess the satraps in west of the Euphrates, who had detailed how much gold and everything that they had to be brought back. Uh, they're starting to send letters back about how unhappy the Samaritans were. Just like let me just read. It said, "Be it known to the king that the Jews who came up from thee have come to Jerusalem, the rebellious and wicked city." So how can they be the rebellious and wicked city if the Cyrus decree is the first? This just happened, and so it's in Zerubbabel's time that this is even before even Ezra came down there. This is the first of the first. So if so how can they be a rebellious city? Well, you would say, oh, it happened in the time of the Babylonians. Well, the Babylonians, you say, are not the same people as the Persians. Well, so how would they be? And so you would say, oh, these are just like anti-Semitic people, and this is just a quote, so this isn't true Bible. If Ezra said it, this is the word of God, right? If it wasn't like quoting somebody else that was not Jewish, then it would be that would be the word of God. But they're quoting, like, let's say a Samaritan or a satrap or something, that therefore it's not the word of God. But Balaam somehow skirts that standard, and like, this is where it comes into where David had been this kind of replacement theology, how Jerusalem is a sort of replacement theology, how there was and the Edomites had taken over, that this ruddy kind of people that hung out in the desert and had come up and taken over, that this is a recurring motif. And their connections with Hebron. Let's say Hebron is way down in the dusty desert. That they even called it Arba, like similar letters to Arab. And that they, in 1948, they didn't have a big presence. Let's say the Jewish population in Hebron, Al Khalil, Kiryat Arba, and they want to act like these different people are buried there, both sides, and there's no truth to it whatsoever. It's at least not in a known way. And so it's a verse 12. It say they are rebuilding, and its walls are set in order, and they have established the foundations of it. So because the language is kind of vague, they don't say what the walls are, what the foundations are. So one's mind would be like, well, maybe they're talking about the foundations and walls of the temple. And then Nehemiah, he's talking about the city. Well, where do people live? Like, let's say Cyrus made this decree, and he did. Like, this is evidence. I mean, the Yehudim had appropriated it, or rather expropriated the decree of Cyrus to apply it for themselves, and the ahistoric historicity, of it all makes the fact that it was exclusive to one race of people, the freeing of the captives, almost necessitates making the book of Nehemiah, as though it was some mythological king in some later date that we don't have any record of this story of Esther or anything that comes out of Babylon. And so this Greek account of first Esdras, I believe, is primary, that it's an older text, and this later books of Ezra and Nehemiah were based on it, that they wanted to change a few things about it to better fit the historicity as well as the narrative coming from Babylon. And so the original story comes from the Septuagint, which is called First Esdras or Third Ezra, and that's the Greek version, and it's just the same story over and over, and so it's just a double telling, of the same thing. So like if you look at the Gospels, you could say that's kind of the power of it. It's these different witnesses, and this is a Jewish term, two with witnesses. I don't care how many people, two, three, 100. If it's a lie, it's a lie. I mean, they tell you all these stories of these evil priests, and as Daniel 13, I think, or is it 14? And sons of Belial and all these liars that doesn't matter how many witnesses you have. That's not why it's powerful. Scholars will tell you that if you have multiple witnesses that don't say verbatim word for word, that means they're not copying, and that gives it further credence. And so if you go back to Genesis, there's a double telling of a lot of the different stories, and a lot of scholars will say, well, that's the Yahwist and the Elohist source, and they got it backwards and reciprocated, where it's actually the Elohist source is actually older, and uh, Israel, Jacob is not Jacob, Joshua, the northern kingdom, Ephraim rather. That's actually often called older than Judah. Well, Judah's so that's how they give this ancient Deuteronomist history of coming from Moab, Edom and Moab, and that's where God's first presence was. So that as Joshua came from Moab, they wanted to appropriate this Canaanite story as much as they can, but that's why there's this disconnect between and the hard flow in from end of Deuteronomy to beginning of Joshua, because Joshua was not the book that came after Deuteronomy, and Deuteronomy did not precede Joshua originally, and so when it comes to verse 12, it say, chapter 12 verse, or chapter 4 verse 12 of Ezra, they're trying to tell some story and spin it in some sort of way that telling the people east of the Euphrates that these people came out west Euphrates and ran amok and are not going to do what you think they're going to do. They're going to get rebellious, but I mean that's what the freeing the captives is in the first place. Why would he want them to build their temple? And as Zechariah had said, that Zerubbabel had laid the very top stone and finished the process in his lifetime. So we're thinking, what, 6th century? And so if this happened back in the 6th century or thereabouts, or the beginning of the 5th century BC, then this whole kind of the 4th century BC, 5th century BC, has to be some different story or something, or these people are living for an incredible amount of time, and so it's very problematic. And so in the Babylonian Jewish rabbinics, they will kind of almost deify these people. There's the great assembly, the Kohen Gadol, and so and that's not respective. That's inverted. So in the same verse they're talking about Darius, even though this is Cyrus, and in the same chapter, I mean, they were talking about Artaxerxes. So it's really almost inconsistent. And when you get into First Ezra chapter 2, that's where you run into a big problem. So just peep this. I mean, the language is like verbatim. That I mean, somebody copied somebody. So a lot of people that are partial, and you might argue I'm partial. I think I'm just bringing something that's hasn't had it given a fair shake of partiality in too long a time. I mean, like we're talking about. If you look at First Ezra 1, they're talking about Josiah, and this is where Deuteronomy come from. This is where Judaism come from. It was the Edomites that had broken off from the respective other people and followed the Elohist source, and this happened in the time of Josiah. That didn't happen way back in the time of Moses, or even later in the time of David, or anything. This they back in the day they were still using the Uma Thurman or whatever, the Urim and Thummim, and that's cleromancy, and they were using necromancy, the teraphim, and they were using all these abominable witchcraft kind of things that they weren't listening to Jeremiah's or whatever. They were Jeremy or whatever it says in the Septuagint. They weren't. They were. Even Hosea was talking about the Uma Thurman and everything, and so that's this Yahweh source come from Josiah, and uh, it's a lot later than they say it is, and so I just wanted to pick it up at verse 16. If you see a lot of the parallelism between First Ezra 2 and Ezra 4, but they're talking about Cyrus just verses before, but then all jumps down to Artaxerxes, but this is supposed to be the same time period, the same chapter. I mean, come on now. But in the time of Artaxerxes, king of the Persians, Balamus, Mithridates, and Telebus, and this Tubalius, is very reminiscent of what was it, Genesis 15? Because in Genesis 15, I want to get this right now because I said 15 last time. It's actually 14. It talks about the oh no, Genesis 15. That was a title, the King of Golim. I was thinking that was Tubal was title, the King of Golim. But if you go to the sons of Japheth in Genesis 9 or Genesis 10, you have Tubal in verse 2, chapter 10, verse 2. And Rathamus and Baalthamus and Similius, the secretary, and all the others, are commissioned to dwelling in Samaria and other places. So Ezra wants to paint the Samaritans as foreigners. And this is back when they used to call it Judea. They didn't call it Judea by the time Jesus came around. There was no that had fallen out of use, like between Herod Agrippa, I think around that kind of time period. To King Artaxerxes, our lord, the servants, Remotheus, story writer, and Similius, the scribe, and the Lord Council, and the judges of Cilicia and Phoenicia, which is where the word Phoenician, this is where Hebrew, Greek, and all the languages come from. They were the first to write Mediterranean. Language is the oldest form language other than cuneiform that paleography is really talk about in terms of major ones. And and maybe there was something in China or India that was coming about the same time period, but it was coming from India. It's probably coming from Persia, and that was probably coming from the cuneiform. The China, I don't think they knew anything. I think there was like a separate history, and it's hard to say. Well, that's not really the subject here. So to the king Artaxerxes, our lord, thy servants. Story. Okay, this is verse 18. Here it goes. Be it known that the Lord King, that the Jews that are up from you to us, being come to Jerusalem, that rebellious and wicked city, do build the marketplaces. So it says, do build the marketplaces, and that makes sense because Jeremiah said the land would be followed for 7 years, 70 years, and then to rebuild the city. The crew would go out to rebuild the city in 70 years. Well, that lines up perfectly with Cyrus, and that's the big decree. That's the one that secular history checks out. But they want to get it twisted. But they would say he would just build the temple. He didn't build the city. He just built the temple. Well, that doesn't make any sense because you can't have a temple of any, especially with these so-called Samaritans hating them or whatever. Like that would even survive without having land that you're farming, to have marketplace, to have houses, and if you don't have the walls, if they can't rebuild the walls, then what's the point? And and they repair the walls. They say to rebuild the wicked city, do build the marketplace, and repair the walls of it, and do the foundations of the temple. And that's the word right there. So they build up the walls of the city, and build the foundations. Oh, sorry, I've been chapter 8. For Omega Fitness, I just saw this. The topic is First Ezra 2:18, which is the Greek. First Ezra is the Greek Ezra, and so I was pointing out how in Ezra they want to like make this later story Nehemiah that doesn't corroborate perfectly the story of Ezra, nor does it distinguish itself as being much later enough sufficiently, or give a secular king's name to make it a reputable source enough to have that check out as much as First Esdras, where you have the have Artaxerxes, and you have Zerubbabel, and you have Zechariah, and all these other different people. Everything happened in this time period, and instead of displacing that, where normally with like the gospel or the Genesis, if you have two different stories, you take both of them. They want to just throw this story out first, Ezra's, because there's a few pieces they don't like about it, just like Tobit. Here's Tobit, this northern tribe, this lost tribe, keeping the law as a Jewish person, even Jerusalem and everything, and so it doesn't fit the narrative. And like Luke wasn't trying to fit the narrative. Luke wasn't trying to, like Matthew, make it a Jewish fulfillment. They were saying Jesus was Jewish, he's a good Jewish kid and everything like that, but as he wasn't, it wasn't like this multifaceted, layered fulfillment as the later authors like Matthew and John kind of. But so I want to say about verse 18 here. So they repair the walls of the city, and then they lay the foundations of the temple. And so when you read uh, Ezra 4, it's a rebuild the walls and the foundation, and there's no subject, or there's no object. What are they rebuilding? They're not really. They're rebuilding walls and the foundation, but it's so ambiguous. You don't really. You could see it either way, and with the context, you would say, "Oh, well, the Samaritans are lying, and they're not rebuilding any walls to the city. If they were building walls, it would be to the temple." And so, but I mean, if they're building the foundation, they're not building the walls. Well, people say, well, they're building the foundation to the walls, or something which just makes it further and further harder to understand instead of the simple definition, which is simply that they were building the walls of the city, because that's what the 7 years of Jeremiah point to, is the rebuilding of the city. It was for the ground to lay fallow. It wasn't to not have a temple. And so, yes, the temple is crucial, but that happened with the building of the city and the laws. This is say clearly in chapter 2, verse 18 of First Ezra, the foundation of the temple and the city walls. I mean, you have to build up the city walls. You can have gaps in the wall to have in ancient society in the Middle East by the desert to not to have close up the gaps in the wall. That's the first thing you do. I mean, it only makes sense. And they want to create this story in Nehemiah to come later to where it has the same story where they're once again finding out that there's foreigners. I mean, even the time of Ezra, let alone the time of Nehemiah, you're having 3 generations, 6 generations between Nebuchadnezzar and the Greek era, the entire Persian era, trying to be encapsulated in the later prophets and stuff, and not all of them, but I'm just talking about 3 in particular that are mentioned, 2 of them by name right here, by Ezra. And so, and the third being, who some a lot of scholars would say is Ezra. And so, if you go to Ezra 9, this 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 isn't true for Esdras. I think Esdras, I think that because it was Greek, they didn't realize that the Edomites were part of Israel by this point, because it says by the 3rd generation they'll be allowed. And Antipater had said he had come from Babylon. And if you read Jeremiah 51, I think it is, the oracles of the nation, that Esau was going to get into captivity too. And if they're speaking similar language and they lived side by side, the border could be just like a wadi or something between the two of them, that very porous, and if they're in cities side by side as they're displacing each other and stuff like that, that it would only make sense that they would be more likely to marry in captivity than, let's say, a native-born Persian or Babylonian rather. And so when you read Ezra 9, it's interesting if you read the different nations, and if you read the Torah, let's say, I think it was Deuteronomy 23, that you couldn't really marry an Ammonite, but they want to go back to Genesis and say Ammonites were children of God, so that Rehoboam can be considered of a pure seed. But I'm not talking about the Ammonites and Moabites. I'm talking about the Edomites. If you look at Ezra 9:1, Ezra 9:2, there's no mention of Edomites. I mean, there is in First Ezra's, but I think that the Persian understanding, the Pharisaical understanding, which brought Esther and Nehemiah, that and Ezra, not at First Ezra. This is the Greek, the more Greek one, the one that probably more like the Maccabees would be using, the older source. And they would you know uh yeah, just that the Edomites would be after a few generations, just like the to not abhor the Edomites, you not abhor the Egyptians, but the Egyptians did get somewhat castigated and their hair ripped out in, let's say, Ezra 9 or Nehemiah 13, which is the same event, but they want to say this a different event. And but the problem with the Egyptians is they say Paul was mistaken for Egyptian, Joseph, Jacob, Jesus, all these different people were mistaken for Egyptian, and the Edomites, some different race of people. Well, between like uh, between Israel and Egypt is just desert, and this desert area is the Bedouins, and this is who they want to say Israel is, or the Edomites are. They want to say that they're the Arabs, these Bedouins, these Ishmaelites, these Midianites, and they want to push them onto that side, even though they're really on their side. And I don't see how they can be a different side of race of people. They say that these Edomites are a different race of people when they were mistaken for Egyptians, and this desert race that they don't want to be is right between them. So how can they be that different altogether? And they don't understand Egyptian. It was only with the Rosetta Stone recently, in the let's say 20, starting to decipher Egyptian, and it's actually a very phonetic language that it's not as pictographic as they had thought, and that um, it has cognates corresponding in the same Semitic languages that Ugaritic and all that of the area just to the north of them, and these people were expanding the language uh, at the same time, contemporaneously, and Moses was supposed to have learned from the Midianites and the Egyptians, and I think I'll make a part 2 to this because I have a lot more to say about this, but I just kind of want to reset and think about what I have said and what I want to say yet. So that's that. Thank you.